Hey guys, tonight we journey into the extraordinary life and calculated legacy of Lord Tywin Lannister, the Golden Lion of Casterly Rock, who transformed from a mocked young heir into the most feared man in all the Seven Kingdoms, from his ruthless restoration of family honor to his masterful orchestration of kings and wars from the shadows. His story is one of unwavering determination, brilliant strategy, and the terrible price of absolute power. So before you settle in for this epic tale, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Deep beneath the golden halls of Casterly Rock, where ancient mining tunnels stretch into darkness older than memory, a young boy once discovered something that would haunt him forever. Not gold, though the Lannisters had more of that than any house in Westeros, not some forgotten treasure from the Age of Heroes. What 13-year-old Tywin Lannister found in those depths was far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. A letter, crumpled, discarded, forgotten by servants who thought no one would care about such things. But this letter contained mockery so vicious, insults so cutting, that it would reshape not just one boy's destiny, but the very fate of the Seven Kingdoms. The letter spoke of his father, Lord Tytos Lannister, in terms that made young Tywin's hands shake with rage. It called him weak, pathetic, a toothless lion who gave gold away like candy and took insults like gifts. But worse than any insult to his father were the jokes about what House Lannister had become. How other lords gathered in their halls to laugh about the mighty Lannisters, reduced to begging for respect they should command by right. That moment in those dark tunnels would birth something terrible and magnificent, a transformation that would echo through generations, reshaping not just the Westerlands but all of Westeros. What happened next would create legends and nightmares in equal measure. But what drove that transformation wasn't just wounded pride. In those depths, with that crumpled letter in his trembling hands, Tywin Lannister made a promise that would define everything he became. A promise so absolute, so merciless, that its fulfillment would require him to become someone his childhood self wouldn't recognize. And decades later, when that same boy had become the most powerful man in the realm, when kings sought his counsel and enemies whispered his name in terror, he would discover that the price of keeping that promise was higher than even he had imagined. Higher than gold, higher than power, higher than legacy itself. Tonight we'll uncover what that promise was, how it shaped one of the most complex and fascinating characters in all of Westeros, and why understanding Tywin Lannister is essential to understanding the very soul of the Game of Thrones. We'll explore the mind that could orchestrate the Red Wedding, the heart that could never quite connect with his own children, and the iron will that held a crumbling kingdom together even as it tore his own family apart. This is the story of how a laughed-at boy became a legend, how love for family became a weapon of terror, and how the pursuit of respect became an obsession that would ultimately destroy everything he fought to protect. The Golden Lion's roar begins here, in those ancient tunnels beneath Casterly Rock, with a 13-year-old boy holding a letter that would change the world. In the year 246 after Aegon's conquest, when Aegon V still sat the Iron Throne and dragons remained only in legend and stone, the Westerlands stretched golden and prosperous beneath the setting sun. This was a realm unto itself, carved from the very bones of the earth, where mountains held more wealth than most kingdoms could dream of possessing. Casterly Rock rose from the western coast like a monument to the audacity of men who dared to hollow out a mountain and call it home. 3 times the height of the wall, twice as wide as Winterfell, this fortress had been carved from living stone by countless generations of Lannisters and their subjects. Every hall, every chamber, every tunnel had been meticulously crafted from the golden-veined rock that gave the castle its name. The rock was more than a castle. It was a statement written in stone, declaring to all who beheld it that House Lannister commanded not just wealth, but the vision and will to transform the very landscape to their purposes. Ships in Lannisport Harbor, 5 miles below, appeared as distant toys against the fortress's immense bulk. From its highest towers, a lord could see clear to the Iron Islands on a cloudless day, and south along the coast until the world curved away from sight. Within those carved halls lived treasures that would make the Iron Bank of Bravos weep with envy. Tapestries woven from threads of gold depicted the legendary deeds of Land the Clever, the founder of their line, who had supposedly tricked the Casterlys from their ancestral home through wit alone. Suits of armor worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes stood in silent formation along corridors lit by braziers that had burned without interruption for over 300 years. But in 267 AC, when our story truly begins, all this magnificent wealth felt somehow hollow. The golden halls echoed with an emptiness that had nothing to do with vacant rooms and everything to do with vacant respect. The lions carved into every surface seemed to watch with disappointment as their living descendants struggled with something no amount of gold could purchase back once lost. Tywin Lannister stood barely 13 years old, yet already he carried himself with a gravity that made grown men uncomfortable. Tall for his age and broad in the shoulders that would eventually carry the weight of kingdoms, he possessed the distinctive Lannister features that marked him as true-born nobility. His hair caught sunlight like spun gold, his green eyes held depths that seemed far older than his years, and his jaw was set with a determination that suggested steel rather than flesh lay beneath his skin. But those green eyes, so often cold and calculating in the tales told of his later years, still held traces of the boy he had been. When he thought no one was watching, when he stood alone on the rock's highest balconies watching ships come and go from Lannisport's harbor, there were moments where something softer flickered in those depths, something that spoke of dreams not yet hardened into ruthless pragmatism, of a heart not yet armored against the world's cruelties. The boy had been shaped by watching his father's struggles with the impossible burden of leadership. Lord Titus Lannister was, by all accounts, a good man, kind to his small folk, generous to his friends, quick to forgive and slow to anger. In a better world, in a realm where strength was measured by compassion rather than fear, Titus might have been remembered as one of the great lords of his age. But Westeros was not a better world. It was a realm where weakness invited predation, where kindness was seen as stupidity, and where a lord who preferred negotiation to intimidation found his bannermen testing boundaries like wolves testing fences. Titus had learned these truths too late, and by the time he recognized them, the damage to House Lannister's reputation was already spreading like poison through the political bloodstream of the Westerlands. Kevan Lannister, Tywin's younger brother by 4 years, served as both companion and mirror to his elder sibling's transformation. Where Tywin was learning to build walls around his emotions, Kevan remained open and trusting. Where Tywin studied every slight and catalogued every insult for future reference, Kevan still believed that tomorrow might bring better news than today. The two brothers were inseparable, yet each passing month saw them growing into men who would view the world through increasingly different lenses. Their sister Genna, sharp-tongued and sharper-witted than either of her brothers, understood the family situation with a clarity that sometimes frightened even Tywin. She alone seemed to grasp both the scope of the problem they faced and the kind of solution it would require. When she spoke of family honor and the price of weakness, her words carried a weight that settled into Tywin's bones and stayed there, growing heavier with each passing season. Maester Crelin, keeper of Casterly Rock's extensive records and chronicler of Lannister history, provided the historical context that would prove so crucial to understanding the family's current predicament. His lessons in the solar, surrounded by ledgers and letters dating back centuries, revealed patterns that repeated across generations. Strong lords built legacies that weak successors squandered. Respected houses fell from grace through kindness, mistaken for weakness. The lessons were clear for those with eyes to see them. In the year 267, as spring settled across the Westerlands with its promise of renewal and growth, 13-year-old Tywin Lannister began to understand that renewal sometimes required destruction first, that growth might demand cutting away diseased branches to save the tree, that the promises carved in gold throughout Casterly Rock, the boasts of Lannister supremacy and eternal strength, were only as valuable as the will to enforce them. The boy stood at a crossroads between the man his father hoped he would become and the man circumstances seemed to demand, between mercy and ruthlessness, between the Lord who rules through love and the Lord who rules through fear, between preserving his father's gentle legacy and forging something entirely new from the white-hot fires of absolute necessity. He did not yet know that within months, events would remove that choice from his hands entirely. That forces already in motion would demand he declare himself definitively on one side or the other. That the comfortable middle ground between strength and kindness was about to be washed away in rivers of blood and gold. But standing in those golden halls, watching spring light filter through windows carved by ancient hands, young Tywin Lannister was already beginning to sense the shape of the choice that would define not just his own life, but the lives of everyone he would ever love. The choice between remaining his father's son or becoming something altogether more dangerous. Something that future generations would fear to name aloud. The morning that would forever alter the course of Westeros history began like any other in the golden halls of Casterly Rock. Spring mist clung to the harbor below, while servants moved quietly through corridors preparing the castle for another day. But in the solar where Lord Tytos Lannister conducted the business of ruling, something had shifted overnight. The air itself seemed heavier, pregnant with the kind of tension that precedes storms. Tywin found his father hunched over his desk, surrounded by scrolls and letters that had arrived with the dawn ravens. The older man's face, usually soft with the gentle expression that had earned him both love and contempt throughout the Westerlands, now bore lines of worry so deep they seemed carved into his flesh. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted yet another piece of correspondence, read it, and set it aside with a sigh that seemed to come from his very soul. "Father," Tywin said quietly, approaching the desk with the careful steps of someone walking onto a battlefield they don't yet understand. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dust motes that danced between them like tiny golden spirits, but neither man noticed such beauty when uglier truths demanded attention. Tytos looked up, and Tywin saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before. Not just worry or frustration, emotions that had become familiar companions in recent months. This was fear. Raw, undisguised terror at the magnitude of what was unfolding around them. The sight of it hit Tywin like a physical blow, forcing him to recognize that whatever was happening was far worse than he had imagined. "Sit, my boy," Tytos said, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "There are things you must understand, things I should have told you years ago, but I kept hoping." He trailed off, gathering scattered papers with hands that refused to remain steady. "I kept hoping that kindness would be enough, that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions to their disagreements." The papers before them told a different story entirely. Letters from House Rains of Castamere spoke not in the respectful tones due to their overlord, but with barely concealed mockery. Lord Roger Rain had written to inform Lord Tytos that the gold he had borrowed would be repaid when convenient, a phrase that dripped with contempt for the lender's obvious inability to enforce his own contracts. Worse still were the reports from across the Westerlands describing how other houses had begun following Rain's example. House Tarbeck had publicly refused to answer a summons from Casterly Rock, claiming their loyalty belonged to friends who honored friendship rather than demanding it through birthright. Smaller houses whispered that perhaps the time had come for new leadership in the Westerlands, leadership that understood the difference between strength and the accident of noble blood. Even servants in lesser keeps had begun speaking of the Lannisters with a casual disrespect that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. But it was the newest letter, the one that had arrived before dawn, and sent Lord Tytos into his current state of barely controlled panic, that revealed the true scope of their family's catastrophe. House Rain had issued what could only be described as an ultimatum, disguised as an invitation. They proposed a great feast at Castamere, ostensibly to celebrate renewed friendship between the houses. The subtext, however, was unmistakable to anyone who understood the language of Westerosi politics. Lord Roger Rain was demanding that Lord Tytos come to Castamere, not as an honored guest, but as a supplicant to sit at another man's table in his own domain, and beg for terms that would leave House Lannister's authority in shambles. The invitation specified that Lord Tytos should come with a small, peaceful escort, language that transformed courtesy into humiliation. It was a public declaration that the Rains no longer feared Lannister strength because they no longer believed such strength existed. Tywin absorbed each revelation like body blows, feeling something fundamental shifting inside his chest. The comfortable certainties of his childhood, the unquestioned assumption that being born a Lannister meant something significant in the world, crumbled with each new detail his father shared. But alongside that destruction, something else was being born, something harder and infinitely more dangerous. "What will you do?" Tywin asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. He could see it in his father's posture, in the defeated slump of shoulders that had once carried themselves with dignity. Lord Tytos was preparing to accept terms that would reduce House Lannister to vassals in all but name within their own lands. "I will go to Castamere," Tytos said quietly. "What choice do I have? If we refuse, they'll declare us enemies of peace. Other houses will rally to their cause, claiming they only seek justice for past grievances. We'll face not just the Rains and Tarbecks, but half the Westerlands united against us." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Tywin felt something crystallize within him, a clarity so sharp it was almost painful. This was the moment he realized when a man's true nature reveals itself. When comfortable illusions are stripped away and only the essential self remains. Some men faced with such revelations would bend and accept diminishment as the price of peace. Others would break entirely, overwhelmed by the magnitude of forces arrayed against them. But Tywin Lannister was discovering he belonged to a third category entirely. Men who see catastrophe approaching and respond not with submission or surrender, but with a cold calculation that transforms disaster into opportunity. The boy who had entered this solar just moments earlier would not be the same one who left it. "Father," he said, his voice carrying a new quality that made Tysos look up in surprise. "What if there was another choice? What if we could make them fear to speak our name again?" The older man studied his son's face and saw something there that both thrilled and terrified him. The gentle features he remembered from childhood had not changed, but behind those familiar green eyes burned something that belonged to a much older, much harder man. "Tywin, what are you thinking?" But Tywin was no longer thinking in the way his father understood thinking. He was seeing patterns that connected past humiliations to present crises, seeing possibilities that transformed weakness into strength through the simple expedient of refusing to accept limitations others imposed, seeing a future where House Lannister's enemies learned that there were fates worse than death, and that mercy shown to wolves only encouraged them to hunt in larger packs. Standing in that solar, surrounded by evidence of his family's decline, 13-year-old Tywin Lannister made the choice that would define everything he became. Not the choice his father hoped for, which would have involved finding some middle path between strength and submission. Not the choice that mercy counseled, which would have accepted diminished status as preferable to conflict. Instead, he chose to become whatever was necessary to ensure that no one would ever again dare to laugh at the name Lannister. Whatever the cost to his soul, whatever the price in blood and gold, whatever transformation would be required of the boy he had been. The morning mist was beginning to lift from Lannisport Harbor, revealing the busy commerce that had made House Lannister wealthy beyond measure. But wealth, as the letters scattered across Lord Titus' desk made clear, was worthless without the will to protect it. Power meant nothing if others felt free to ignore it. Legacy crumbled when heirs lacked the spine to defend what their ancestors had built. These were lessons that Tywin Lannister would never forget, and which he would ensure the world learned as thoroughly as he had. 3 days after that fateful morning in the Solar, the ancient bells of Casterly Rock rang out across the Westerlands with a sound that hadn't been heard in living memory. Not the gentle chimes that announced births or weddings, nor the solemn tolls that marked deaths or holy days. These were the deep, resonant war bells that summoned bannermen to duty and declared that House Lannister would no longer suffer insults in silence. Tywin stood on the rock's highest balcony, watching as his father's orders transformed the peaceful landscape below into something altogether more purposeful. Riders thundered along every road leading away from Casterly Rock, carrying messages sealed with golden wax and bearing the authority of Lord Tywin himself. But though his father's name was on the letters, the words within them bore the unmistakable stamp of Tywin's colder logic. The transformation had begun the moment Tywin presented his alternative to accepting the Rain ultimatum. Instead of traveling to Castamere as a supplicant, Lord Tywin would indeed journey forth from his seat, but with an army at his back, rather than a handful of peaceful escorts. If House Rain wanted to test Lannister's strength, they would discover whether their confidence was justified in the harsh mathematics of steel and fire. Lord Titus had initially recoiled from his son's proposal, his gentle nature rebelling against the implications of such decisive action. But as they discussed the alternatives through the long hours of that day, examining every possible path forward, the older man had been forced to confront a truth that his kindness had long obscured. In the Game of Thrones there were only two positions, those who inspired fear and those who suffered it. House Lannister had spent too many years in the second category. Now, as banners began arriving in response to the summons, Tywin felt the first stirrings of something that would sustain him through all the dark choices ahead. Not satisfaction, exactly, though he took grim pleasure in seeing their enemies' carefully laid plans disrupted by unexpected Lannister resolve. Rather, it was the deeper contentment that comes from aligning one's actions with necessity rather than hope. Sir Kevan had thrown himself into the military preparations with an enthusiasm that might have surprised those who knew only his gentle demeanor. But Tywin recognized the steel beneath his brother's softer surface, understanding that loyalty to family could transform even the kindest men into formidable enemies when circumstances demanded it. Together they reviewed maps and supplies, coordinated with arriving bannermen, and ensured that when House Lannister finally moved, it would do so with devastating efficiency. The responses to Lord Titus's summons revealed the true scope of Lannister influence, despite recent humiliations. House Crakehall arrived first, their boar banners snapping in the spring wind as 500 mounted men made camp in the fields below Casterly Rock. Lord Sumner Crakehall himself sought immediate audience, declaring that any insult to House Lannister was an insult to every house that had sworn them fealty. House Lefford followed within hours, their golden tree adding another 1,000 spears to the growing army. Lord Leo Lefford brought disturbing intelligence from the northern reaches of the Westerlands, confirming that House Rain had indeed been building alliances and stockpiling weapons in preparation for confrontation. What had begun as loans and borrowed gold had evolved into something far more dangerous, a coordinated attempt to fundamentally reshape the power structure of their region. But it was the arrival of House Marbrand that truly demonstrated the extent of Lannister support among their more distant bannermen. Lord Daemon Marbrand had ridden hard from Ashermark with 300 knights, leaving his own lands barely defended in order to answer his overlord's call. His presence sent a clear message to wavering houses throughout the Westerlands that the ancient oaths of fealty still carried weight among honorable men. As the army grew, so did Tywin's understanding of the forces that had shaped his family's current crisis. Each bannerman brought reports of rain agents spreading gold and promises throughout the Westerlands, systematically undermining Lannister authority through a combination of bribery and propaganda. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its effectiveness. House Rain had not simply grown rebellious through arrogance or opportunism. They had crafted a deliberate strategy to supplant House Lannister as the dominant power in the Westerlands, using the very wealth they had borrowed from Casterly Rock to finance their own rise to supremacy. The loans that Lord Titus had extended in good faith had become weapons turned against his own authority. Yet for all their careful planning, the Rains had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that Lord Titus would remain predictably merciful, that his gentle nature would prevent him from responding to their provocations with the kind of force that might disrupt their schemes. They had not accounted for the possibility that a 13-year-old boy might possess both the vision to see what was necessary and the influence to convince his father to act upon it. Standing in the great hall of Casterly Rock on the eve of departure, surrounded by battle-hardened lords who had answered their summons despite the risks involved, Tywin felt the weight of responsibility settling around his shoulders like a cloak woven from steel and shadow. These men had pledged their lives to House Lannister's cause based on trust that their overlords possessed both the wisdom to command and the strength to protect those who served loyally. Lord Titus addressed the assembled bannermen with words that carried more authority than he had commanded in years. The gentle lord who had struggled to enforce his will through kindness alone had found unexpected strength in righteous anger, discovering that sometimes mercy could only be preserved through the threat of its opposite. His speech that night would be remembered by those present as the moment when House Lannister reclaimed its voice after years of uncertain whispers. But Tywin knew, even as he listened to his father's stirring words about honor and justice, that speeches alone would not resolve their crisis. The Rains had chosen confrontation over submission, believing that Lannister weakness had progressed beyond the point where mere displays of strength could restore proper order. They would need to be proven wrong through methods that left no room for future misunderstanding. As dawn approached and the great war host prepared to march from Casterly Rock, young Tywin Lannister took one last look at the peaceful harbor of Lannisport spread below. Ships rocked gently at anchor, merchants prepared their wares for another day of profitable trade, and children played in streets that had known no violence within living memory. All of that was about to change. The decisions made in the coming days would echo through generations, shaping not just the fate of House Lannister, but the very nature of power in the Seven Kingdoms. When they returned to these golden halls, if they returned at all, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The boy who had discovered that crumpled letter in the tunnels beneath the rock was about to become someone else entirely, someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than anyone had imagined possible. The march toward Castamere began at first light, with nearly 3,000 men moving through the rolling hills of the Westerlands under banners that had not flown together in warfare for more than a generation. The sight should have filled any Lannister heart with pride, yet Tywin rode beside his father with a growing sense that their impressive display of strength might prove insufficient against enemies who had spent years preparing for exactly this confrontation. The first disturbing revelation came from their scouts just hours into the journey. Captain Adam Marbrand, leading the advance riders, returned with intelligence that transformed their understanding of the situation entirely. House Rain had not simply fortified Castamere and prepared for siege. They had evacuated their non-combatants to allies throughout the region, suggesting a level of coordination that spoke to months or even years of careful planning. More troubling still were the reports of increased activity at Tarbeck Hall, seat of House Tarbeck, some 40 miles northeast of their position. Smoke rising from their forges indicated intensive weapon production, while unusual numbers of riders had been spotted moving between Tarbeck lands and various minor holds throughout the region. What they had assumed was primarily a Rain rebellion was revealing itself as something far more comprehensive. Lord Tywin called a halt to their advance, while still a day's ride from Castamere, gathering his war council beneath the ancient oak trees that dotted this particular valley. The sight of so many seasoned commanders bent over maps and sharing intelligence should have been reassuring, but Tywin found himself increasingly disturbed by the patterns emerging from their collective knowledge. Sir Kevin had compiled reports from loyalist houses throughout the Westerlands, and the picture they painted was deeply unsettling. Gold had been flowing from both Castamere and Tarbeck Hall to minor houses for months, accompanied by whispered promises of greater autonomy under new leadership. Several lords who had previously seemed neutral in the growing dispute had recently acquired significant quantities of weapons and hired sellswords far beyond their normal needs. They mean to make this about more than debts or slighted honor, Lord Daemon Marbrand observed, his weathered face grim as he studied the tactical situation. This is about reshaping the entire power structure of the Westerlands. They're not just rebelling against House Lannister, they're attempting to replace us entirely. The implications settled over the War Council like a cold fog. If the Rains and Tarbecks had indeed succeeded in creating a broad coalition of houses willing to support their bid for regional dominance, then the army currently encamped around them might find itself outnumbered and surrounded far from the safety of Casterly Rock. Worse, defeat in such circumstances would not simply mean military setback, but the complete collapse of Lannister authority throughout their ancestral domain. Tywin listened to the increasingly worried discussions among his father's advisors with a clarity that surprised him. While grown men with decades of military experience struggled to process the scope of the threat they faced, his young mind was already working through possibilities and contingencies with a cold precision that would have been frightening in someone twice his age. The key insight came to him as he studied the maps showing the positions of various houses throughout the region. The Rains and Tarbecks had indeed constructed an impressive web of alliances and mutual obligations, but like all such networks, it possessed structural weaknesses that could be exploited by those willing to think beyond conventional military responses. "Father," he said quietly, drawing the attention of the entire council, "what if we're approaching this incorrectly? What if instead of trying to defeat their coalition, we make it irrelevant?" Lord Tywin looked at his son with a mixture of pride and apprehension, recognizing that the boy's interventions had proven remarkably prescient but uncertain about what new complications his quick mind might introduce. "What do you mean, Tywin?" The plan that emerged from their extended discussion that evening would later be studied by maesters as a masterwork of political and military strategy, though few would fully grasp the cold calculations that made it possible. Rather than advancing directly toward Castamere and allowing their enemies to dictate the terms of engagement, the Lannister force would split into multiple columns designed to isolate and neutralize individual components of the rebel alliance before they could coordinate their response. But the true genius of Tywin's approach lay not in its tactical elements, impressive though those were, but in its psychological warfare. Each rebel house would be given a final opportunity to renounce their alliance with the Rains and Tarbecks, accompanied by detailed evidence of the fate that awaited those who persisted in defying Lannister authority. The goal was not simply military victory, but the complete destruction of the rebel coalition's morale and unity. The intelligence gathering required for such an approach revealed disturbing details about the depth of anti-Lannister sentiment that had been allowed to fester throughout the Westerlands. Houses that had served loyally for centuries had been gradually turned against their overlords through a combination of material incentives and carefully crafted propaganda about Lannister decline and weakness. Lord Tywin struggled visibly with the implications of what their investigation revealed. The gentle lord who had hoped to govern through consensus and goodwill was being forced to confront the reality that significant portions of his own bannermen had been actively working to undermine his authority while smiling to his face and accepting his hospitality. "How did it come to this?" he asked his son during one of their private conversations that week. "How did houses that I've known since childhood come to hate us so deeply?" Tywin's answer would haunt Lord Tywin for the remainder of his life, though its brutal honesty was exactly what the situation demanded. "They don't hate us, father. They simply stopped fearing us. And when fear disappears, respect follows soon after. What we're seeing now is what happens when other men realize that kindness without strength is just another form of weakness." The scouts continued bringing reports that painted an increasingly complex picture of the forces arrayed against them. House Rain had indeed transformed Castamere into a formidable fortress, but their preparations suggested they expected a conventional siege rather than the more sophisticated approach that Tywin was developing. Similarly, the Tarbecks appeared to be concentrating their forces defensively rather than positioning for the kind of mobile campaign that might disrupt Lannister operations. Most significantly, intercepted communications between rebel houses revealed growing nervousness about the unexpected Lannister response to their ultimatum. They had planned for Lord Tywin to either submit to their demands or respond with the kind of fumbling, half-hearted military action that had characterized previous Lannister attempts to enforce authority. The swift mobilization of such a substantial force, combined with the obvious strategic planning behind its deployment, was forcing them to reconsider assumptions about Lannister capabilities. Yet even as their intelligence painted an increasingly clear picture of rebel plans and capabilities, Tywin found himself troubled by deeper questions about the nature of the choice his family faced. Victory in the coming confrontation would require methods that went far beyond traditional military conquest. It would demand a level of ruthlessness that would fundamentally alter how House Lannister was perceived throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Standing in his tent on the final night before they reached Castamere, listening to the sounds of an army preparing for what might be the most important battle in Lannister history, young Tywin contemplated the price of the transformation that circumstances seemed to demand. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock had already changed beyond recognition, but he sensed that far greater changes lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring the first test of whether House Lannister possessed the will to do what was necessary to preserve their legacy. The answer to that question would reshape not just their family's future, but the very nature of power in Westeros itself. The initial success of Tywin's strategy seemed to validate his unconventional approach to the rebellion. Within 3 days of implementing his multi-pronged assault on the rebel coalition, 2 minor houses had formally renounced their alliance with the Rains and publicly reaffirmed their loyalty to House Lannister. The speed of these defections created a ripple effect throughout the region, as other houses began reconsidering their positions in light of the sudden shift in momentum. Lord Tywin received the news of these early victories with a relief so profound it seemed to physically transform him. The burden that had weighed on his shoulders for months appeared to lighten as reports arrived, confirming that his son's calculations had been correct. House Lannister's show of decisive strength was indeed proving more effective than years of patient negotiation and generous concessions. The surrender of House Castamere came first, delivered by a terrified young lord who arrived at the Lannister camp bearing a banner of truce and a formal apology for what he claimed had been a misunderstanding of his obligations. Lord Castamere explained through stammers and nervous glances that gold from Castamere had been presented as payment for past services rather than inducement to future rebellion, and that he had never intended any disrespect toward his rightful overlords. House Seret followed within hours, their submission accompanied by a gift of valuable information about Rain communications and supply lines. Lady Serret herself rode to meet with Lord Tytos, offering not just renewed fealty but active assistance in bringing the rebellion to a swift conclusion. Her detailed knowledge of rebel plans proved invaluable in understanding the scope of the conspiracy they faced. These early successes created an atmosphere of cautious optimism within the Lannister war camp. Veterans who had approached the campaign with grim determination found themselves speculating about a swift resolution that might restore order without the massive bloodshed that many had feared inevitable. Even the most pessimistic advisors began considering the possibility that Tywin's psychological warfare might prove sufficient to collapse the rebellion before serious fighting became necessary. Sir Kevan expressed the growing confidence when he observed to his brother that perhaps their enemies had overestimated their own support and underestimated the enduring loyalty that House Lannister commanded among the reasonable lords of the Westerlands. The speed with which minor houses were abandoning the rebel cause suggested that the coalition had been built on shakier foundations than anyone had realized. Yet Tywin found himself increasingly troubled by aspects of their apparent success that didn't align with his understanding of the forces they were confronting. The ease with which houses were switching sides seemed almost suspiciously convenient, as if their enemies were deliberately allowing their coalition to appear weaker than it actually was. More concerning was the complete absence of any response from either Castamere or Tarbeck Hall to the defections that should have seriously alarmed them. His suspicions crystallized during a strategy session on their fourth night of campaigning. While his father and the other commanders celebrated their diplomatic victories and planned the next phase of operations, Tywin studied the intelligence reports with growing unease. The pattern of surrenders was too neat, too perfectly timed to maximize psychological impact, while revealing minimal information about rebel capabilities or intentions. "Father," he said during a private moment after the council had disbanded, "what if they wanted these houses to abandon their cause? What if we're seeing exactly what Lord Rain intended us to see?" Lord Tysos looked at his son with surprise tinged by mild irritation. The older man had been enjoying the first genuine optimism he'd felt in months, and he was reluctant to have it dampened by his boy's tendency toward pessimistic analysis. "Tywin, we've achieved in days what I feared might take months. Surely you can see that your strategy is working exactly as you predicted." But Tywin's concerns went deeper than tactical details or short-term victories. He had spent enough time studying the correspondence between rebel houses to understand that Lord Roger Rain possessed a sophisticated political mind, capable of complex strategic thinking. The idea that such a man would construct an elaborate conspiracy only to watch it collapse at the first sign of Lannister resistance struck him as fundamentally implausible. The true nature of their situation became clear when scouts brought word that the remaining rebel houses had begun concentrating their forces rather than scattering in panic, as might be expected from a collapsing coalition. Instead of the desperate defensive preparations that should accompany political isolation, Castamere and Tarbeck Hall were showing signs of coordinated military planning that suggested confidence rather than desperation. More disturbing still were reports of unusual activity along the roads leading into the heart of the Westerlands. Merchants reported being turned away from traditional routes by armed men bearing no clear allegiances, while ravens carrying messages to and from various castles had begun disappearing with suspicious frequency. Someone was systematically isolating the region from outside communication and observation. The realization struck Tywin with the force of cold revelation. The minor houses that had surrendered so readily were not the true foundation of the rebel alliance. They were chaff, deliberately included in the conspiracy precisely because their defection would create an illusion of success while the real supporters remained hidden and committed. Lord Rain had anticipated exactly the kind of psychological warfare that Tywin had employed, and had prepared countermeasures that turned apparent Lannister strength into potential weakness. The implications were staggering. If Tywin's analysis was correct, then House Lannister was not winning a swift victory over a collapsing rebellion. Instead, they were being drawn deeper into enemy territory, while their opponents consolidated real strength and prepared for a confrontation under conditions that favored the rebels rather than the loyalists. When Tywin shared his concerns with the War Council the following morning, the response revealed the depth of the trap they might be walking into. Several commanders who had been celebrating their recent successes reacted with skepticism bordering on hostility to suggestions that their achievements might be illusory. The psychology of victory, once established, proved remarkably resistant to evidence that contradicted its comfortable assumptions. Lord Tytos himself struggled to accept his son's darker interpretation of events, though Tywin could see doubt beginning to creep into his father's expression as the implications became clear. The older man had invested so much hope in the possibility of resolving their crisis through strength tempered by mercy that confronting the likelihood of more extreme measures required felt almost unbearable. Yet even as debate raged within their leadership about the true nature of their situation, external events were moving beyond anyone's control. A messenger arrived from Casterly Rock bearing news that transformed speculation into urgent reality. Raiders flying rain banners had struck at several Lannister holdings, burning granaries and driving off livestock in attacks too coordinated to represent opportunistic banditry. The message was unmistakable. While House Lannister had been focused on the rebellion's public face, their enemies had been positioning forces to strike at the economic foundations of Lannister power. The gold mines that funded their wealth, the trade routes that sustained their prosperity, and the agricultural lands that fed their people were all now potential targets for an enemy who had been planning this confrontation far longer than anyone had imagined. Standing in his tent that night, studying maps by flickering candlelight, while the camp settled into the uneasy quiet that precedes battle, Tywin contemplated the magnitude of the challenge they actually faced. The comfortable certainties that had sustained him through the early days of their campaign had dissolved, replaced by the harsh recognition that their enemies possessed both the cunning and the resources to threaten everything his family had built over generations. The boy who had once believed that clear thinking and decisive action would be sufficient to restore Lannister supremacy was learning that some problems required solutions more terrible than he had previously imagined possible. The real war was just beginning. The revelation that their apparent early victories had been carefully orchestrated deceptions forced the Lannister War Council to fundamentally reassess both their strategic position and their understanding of the enemy they faced. As dawn broke over their encampment, now positioned uncomfortably close to hostile territory, with questionable intelligence about rebel strength, the magnitude of Lord Roger Rayne's planning became increasingly apparent. Tywin found himself thrust into a leadership role that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. While his father retained nominal command of their forces, the younger man's ability to see through enemy deceptions had established him as the primary strategic mind, guiding their response to the crisis. Veterans twice his age sought his counsel on matters of tactics and planning, creating a dynamic that both thrilled and terrified him. The deeper investigation into rebel capabilities that followed their sobering reassessment revealed layers of preparation that spoke to years of careful coordination. House Rayne had not simply borrowed gold from the Lannisters and then decided to default on their obligations. They had systematically used those loans to build a network of obligations and alliances that stretched throughout the Westerlands and beyond, creating a shadow power structure that paralleled and undermined traditional loyalties. Captain Adam Marbrand returned from an extended reconnaissance mission with intelligence that transformed their understanding of the military situation entirely. Castamere had been fortified not just against siege, but specifically against the kind of conventional assault that most lords would mount against a rebellious vassal. The castle's defenses incorporated innovations that suggested consultation with military engineers from beyond the Westerlands, possibly even foreign sellswords with experience in the endless wars of Essos. More troubling still was evidence of coordination between the Westerlands rebellion and political movements in other regions of the Seven Kingdoms. Intercepted correspondence hinted at communication with disaffected houses in the Riverlands and the Reach, suggesting that what they faced might be part of a broader pattern of resistance to established authority that could reshape the political landscape of Westeros itself. The scope of the conspiracy forced Tywin to grapple with questions that went far beyond military tactics or regional politics. If the rebellion succeeded in overthrowing House Lannister's authority in the Westerlands, it would demonstrate that even the wealthiest and most powerful houses could be brought down through careful planning and patient subversion. Other regions would witness the collapse of one of the realm's great houses and draw their own conclusions about the stability of the existing order. Yet, as the true dimensions of the threat became clear, Tywin also began to perceive opportunities that others missed. The rebels' very sophistication created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those willing to think beyond conventional approaches to warfare and politics. Their complex network of alliances and obligations, impressive as it was, depended on maintaining confidence among supporters who had committed treason based on promises of future success. The key insight came during one of Tywin's long conversations with Sir Kevan, as the two brothers walked the perimeter of their camp under a star-filled sky that reminded them both of quieter nights spent exploring the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock. The rebellion's strength lay not in any single military advantage, but in the perception among its supporters that House Lannister could no longer effectively protect those who remained loyal or punish those who chose defiance. What if we made the cost of rebellion so terrible that no one would dare risk it again? Tywin asked his brother, the question hanging between them like a blade waiting to fall. What if we demonstrated that challenging House Lannister brings consequences so severe that they become stories told to frighten children for generations? Kevan's response revealed the moral complexity of the choice they faced. The gentle young man, who had always served as Tywin's closest confidant and most trusted advisor, struggled visibly with the implications of what his brother was suggesting. The methods that might prove necessary to crush the rebellion completely would require abandoning principles that had guided House Lannister for generations. Tywin, Kevan said quietly, if we become the kind of people who rule through terror rather than respect, what happens to everything Father taught us about honor and justice? What happens to the house we're trying to save if we destroy its soul in the process of preserving its power? The question would haunt Tywin for the rest of his life, though in that moment he found himself already moving toward an answer that prioritized survival over sentiment. Honor and justice were luxuries that houses could afford only when their existence was not in question. Once enemies had demonstrated their willingness to destroy everything his family had built, the rules governing acceptable responses had fundamentally changed. The intelligence gathering required to implement Tywin's emerging strategy revealed disturbing details about the depth of planning that had gone into the rebellion. Gold from Castamere had been flowing to potential allies for over 2 years, accompanied by careful cultivation of grievances and ambitions that could be directed against House Lannister. The Rains had identified and exploited every weakness in the traditional feudal structure that bound the Westerlands together. Lord Tywin struggled to process the revelation that his own attempts at governing through consensus and kindness had been systematically undermined by enemies who viewed his virtues as exploitable weaknesses. The realization that years of patient effort to build genuine relationships with his bannermen had been rendered meaningless by more ruthless competitors left him questioning fundamental assumptions about leadership and human nature. "How do we fight enemies who have no honor?" he asked his son during one of their increasingly frequent private consultations. "How do we defeat people who are willing to lie, cheat, and betray their way to power while we try to maintain our principles?" Tywin's answer revealed how far his thinking had evolved from the idealistic boy who had discovered that first mocking letter in the tunnels beneath their home. "We become more ruthless than they are, Father. We make them regret ever challenging us so deeply that no one will make the same mistake again. The transformation required to implement such an approach demanded not just tactical adjustments, but a fundamental reimagining of what House Lannister represented in the political landscape of Westeros. The family that had governed through a combination of wealth, tradition, and general competence would need to add fear to their arsenal of tools, wielding it with the same precision they had once applied to trade negotiations and marriage alliances. As their army prepared for the next phase of operations, moving closer to the rebel strongholds while maintaining the mobility necessary to respond to enemy initiatives, Tywin found himself contemplating the nature of the choice that circumstances had forced upon him. The comfortable middle ground between strength and mercy was disappearing, eroded by enemies who had demonstrated their willingness to exploit any sign of restraint as weakness. The evening mist that rose from the valleys around their position carried sounds that spoke to the gathering storm. Ravens called from distant trees, their harsh voices seeming to echo the harsh decisions that could no longer be avoided. The wind through the camp stirred banners and tent flaps with a restlessness that matched the growing tension in every man's heart. Standing on a small rise that provided a view of the surrounding countryside, watching the lights of distant settlements that might harbor friends or enemies, Tywin Lannister felt the weight of destiny settling around him like armor forged from necessity itself. The boy who had hoped that courage and intelligence might be sufficient to restore his family's honor was discovering that some problems could only be solved through methods that would fundamentally change the solver. Tomorrow would bring them within striking distance of Castamere itself, where Lord Roger Rain waited with confidence built on years of careful preparation. The confrontation that followed would determine not just the fate of House Lannister, but the very nature of power in the Seven Kingdoms for generations to come. The approach to Castamere revealed the true scope of Lord Roger Rain's preparations in ways that even Tywin's pessimistic assessments had not fully anticipated. The ancient seat of House Rain sat nestled in a valley surrounded by hills that had been extensively modified with defensive works, creating overlapping fields of fire that would make any conventional assault a costly proposition. More concerning still were the signs of recent expansion that suggested the castle's underground passages had been extended and reinforced. Tywin studied the fortress through the far eyes that Maester Crelin had brought from Casterly Rock's extensive collection of Mirish instruments, noting details that painted an increasingly complex picture of their tactical challenges. The red lion banners flying from Castamere's towers showed no signs of the wear that might indicate hasty preparation. Instead, they displayed the crisp perfection of cloth that had been specially commissioned for this confrontation, suggesting confidence in ultimate victory. The discovery of extensive earthworks surrounding the approaches to Castamere forced the Lannister War Council to confront the possibility that they were facing not just a rebellious vassal, but a rival power that had been preparing for this confrontation far longer than anyone had imagined. The sophistication of the defensive preparations spoke to consultation with military engineers who possessed expertise well beyond what any Westerlands house should reasonably command. Sir Kevin's reconnaissance of the surrounding area revealed additional complications that transformed their strategic calculus entirely. The traditional roads that connected Castamere to the broader network of Westerlands communication had been subtly altered, creating choke points where small forces could delay much larger armies. Supply lines that should have been secure were now vulnerable to harassment by enemies who understood the local terrain far better than their attackers. Most troubling of all was the discovery that Castamere had been connected to an extensive network of underground passages that stretched throughout the surrounding hills. These tunnels, carved from the same red stone that gave the castle its distinctive appearance, provided defenders with the ability to move forces unseen and strike at besiegers from unexpected directions. Any attempt to surround and starve out the fortress would face constant harassment from enemies who could appear and disappear like ghosts. Lord Tywin absorbed each new revelation with growing dismay. His earlier optimism completely evaporated in the face of evidence that their enemies had anticipated every conventional approach to resolving the crisis. The gentle lord who had hoped to restore order through a show of strength was being forced to confront the reality that their opponents had prepared for exactly such a demonstration and had crafted countermeasures that negated traditional military advantages. "They've turned their entire domain into a fortress," observed Lord Daemon Marbrand during one of their strategy sessions, his weathered face grim as he contemplated the tactical challenges they faced. "This isn't just about defending Castamere anymore. They've created conditions where we'll be fighting on their terms no matter how we approach the problem." The implications extended far beyond immediate military concerns. If House Rain could successfully resist a conventional siege mounted by their overlords, other ambitious houses throughout the Seven Kingdoms would take note of the methods that had proven effective. The rebellion in the Westerlands could become a template for similar challenges to established authority in other regions, potentially destabilizing the entire feudal system that maintained order throughout Westeros. Yet, as the scope of the challenge became clear, Tywin found his mind working through possibilities that his father's generation would never have considered. The rebels' very sophistication created opportunities for those willing to abandon conventional approaches in favor of methods that prioritized effectiveness over tradition. If normal siege tactics were inadequate, then perhaps the solution lay in approaches that normal lords would find unthinkable. The key insight emerged during one of Tywin's solitary walks around their encampment as he contemplated the relationship between Castamere's strength and its ultimate vulnerability. The extensive underground passages that made the fortress so difficult to assault conventionally also created possibilities for more creative solutions. The same red stone that provided such excellent defensive positions could potentially be turned against its inhabitants under the right circumstances. His growing understanding of the possibilities inherent in Castamere's unique construction led Tywin to seek consultation with the most experienced miners among their forces. These men, drawn from the depths of Casterly Rock's golden tunnels, possessed knowledge of underground construction and the behavior of stone under stress that proved invaluable in developing alternatives to conventional siege warfare. The conversations that followed would later be remembered as the moment when the character of the conflict fundamentally changed. What had begun as a traditional feudal dispute about debts and obligations was evolving into something altogether more dangerous, a confrontation that would test the very limits of what civilized men were willing to do in pursuit of victory. Master Tywin, the chief engineer responsible for maintaining Casterly Rock's extensive mining operations, provided technical expertise that transformed theoretical possibilities into practical options. His detailed knowledge of how underground waterways could be redirected and controlled opened avenues of approach that no conventional military education would have suggested. The red stone that makes Castamere so distinctive is also relatively soft compared to the rock beneath Casterly Rock. Master Tywin explained during a private consultation that Lord Titus was not invited to attend. With sufficient preparation and the right techniques, it's possible to alter underground water flow in ways that could dramatically affect the structural integrity of passages carved from such material. The implications of this technical assessment settled into Tywin's consciousness like seeds planted in fertile ground. If Castamere's defenders believed their underground network made them invulnerable to conventional assault, they might be unprepared for threats that approached from entirely different directions. The very confidence that their preparations had instilled could become a liability if properly exploited. As evening settled over their position, bringing with it the kind of profound quiet that often precedes momentous decisions, Tywin found himself contemplating the nature of the choice that circumstances had placed before him. The methods that might prove necessary to overcome Castamere's defenses would go far beyond anything attempted in living memory, creating precedents that could fundamentally alter how power was exercised throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns seemed to mock human concerns with their eternal indifference, reminding observers that the rise and fall of houses was but a moment in the vast sweep of history. Yet for those whose lives hung in the balance, the decisions made in the coming days would echo through generations, shaping not just individual destinies, but the very nature of civilization itself. Standing in the darkness outside his tent, listening to the sounds of an army settling into the uneasy rest that precedes battle, Tywin Lannister felt the weight of transformation pressing down upon him like the mountain of stone that sheltered his ancestral home. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock was disappearing, replaced by someone harder and infinitely more dangerous. The gentle sound of water flowing through distant streams carried on the night air, a peaceful counterpoint to the harsh realities of war and politics. Yet even that natural tranquility would soon be turned to purposes that its creators never intended, as human ingenuity found ways to transform the very landscape into an instrument of absolute victory. Tomorrow would bring the final preparations for a confrontation that would reshape the Westerlands forever. The intercepted message that would change everything arrived at dawn on their 7th day, encamped within sight of Castamere's red walls. A Rain courier, captured by Lannister outriders while attempting to reach allies in the eastern Westerlands, carried correspondence that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy in terms so stark that even Tywin's pessimistic assessments had underestimated the danger they faced. Lord Roger Rain's private communications with his co-conspirators spoke not merely of defaulting on debts or asserting independence from Lannister authority. The letters outlined a comprehensive plan to systematically dismantle House Lannister's power throughout the western regions of Westeros, redistributing their vast wealth among a coalition of houses willing to support the new order. The rebellion was not about grievances or autonomy, but about replacement, a coordinated effort to destroy one of the realm's great houses and divide its legacy among the victors. Tywin read through the captured correspondence with growing recognition that they were confronting something unprecedented in recent Westerlands history. The rebels had studied every aspect of Lannister's strength, identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited systematically over time. Their plans encompassed not just military conquest but economic warfare, designed to undermine the gold mines that funded Lannister power and the trade relationships that sustained their influence beyond the Westerlands. The most chilling revelation concerned the rebels' timeline for their campaign. House Rain had been coordinating with potential allies throughout the Seven Kingdoms, suggesting that successful overthrow of Lannister authority would serve as a signal for similar uprisings elsewhere. The stability that had characterized Westeros under the Targaryen monarchy was being deliberately undermined by ambitious houses who believed that chaos offered opportunities for advancement that peace never could. Lord Titus received this intelligence with a silence so profound that it seemed to drain color from his face entirely. The gentle lord who had spent years trying to understand why his kindness had earned contempt rather than loyalty was finally confronting the truth that his enemies had never sought reconciliation. They had identified his compassionate nature as a weakness to be exploited rather than a virtue to be respected. "They mean to destroy us utterly," he said at last, his voice carrying a hollow quality that spoke to the death of illusions he had cherished for decades. "This was never about money or respect or any of the things I thought we could negotiate. They want to erase House Lannister from history and divide our legacy among themselves like spoils of war." The revelation forced every member of the War Council to confront questions they had been avoiding throughout the campaign. Traditional approaches to resolving feudal disputes assumed that all parties shared certain fundamental assumptions about acceptable outcomes, but their enemies had abandoned such constraints entirely, embracing methods that placed them beyond the reach of conventional diplomacy or limited military action. Sir Kevin struggled visibly with the implications of what the captured letters revealed about the nature of their opponents. his gentle soul, so similar to his father's in many ways, recoiled from the recognition that House Lannister faced enemies who would show no mercy if positions were reversed. The comfortable assumption that reasonable men could find reasonable solutions to their disagreements had been shattered beyond repair. "How do we respond to enemies who recognize no limits?" he asked his brother during one of their private conversations that had become increasingly frequent as the campaign progressed. "How do we defeat people who are willing to commit any crime, tell any lie, break any oath if it serves their purposes?" Tywin's answer would define not just the immediate crisis, but the entire trajectory of his future development as a leader. The boy who had once hoped that intelligence and determination might restore his family's honor through conventional means was discovering that some problems could only be solved by those willing to exceed their enemies in ruthlessness and calculation. "We become more terrible than they are," he replied, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "We make the cost of challenging House Lannister so devastating that no one will dare attempt it again for generations. We transform their ambition into a cautionary tale that mothers tell their children to teach them about the consequences of hubris." The captured correspondence also revealed details about rebel military preparations that transformed their understanding of the tactical situation entirely. Castamere had been fortified not just against conventional siege, but specifically against the kind of extended blockade that might starve out defenders over time. Extensive food stores and underground springs provided the resources necessary to outlast any siege that Lord Tytos might be willing to maintain. More concerning still were references to coordination with sellsword companies operating in the eastern regions of Westeros. House Rain had been quietly hiring experienced mercenaries whose loyalty was secured through gold rather than feudal obligation, creating military capabilities that went far beyond what any traditional Westerlands house should reasonably possess. The scope of rebel preparations forced Tywin to acknowledge that conventional military solutions were not merely difficult but potentially impossible, given the constraints under which House Lannister was operating. Their enemies had spent years preparing for this confrontation, while their own side had been caught completely unprepared for warfare of such scope and sophistication. Yet the very completeness of rebel planning also revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those willing to think beyond traditional approaches to siege warfare. The confidence that extensive preparations had instilled in their enemies might blind them to threats that approached from directions they had not anticipated or considered worthy of serious concern. The technical consultations with Master Tywin and his mining engineers took on new urgency as Tywin began developing approaches that would bypass Castamere's conventional defenses entirely. If the fortress could not be taken through normal siege tactics, and if extended blockade was not feasible given rebel resources and outside support, then perhaps the solution lay in methods that transformed the castle's apparent strengths into fatal weaknesses. The conversations that followed would later be remembered as the moment when Tywin Lannister crossed a line that would define the rest of his life. The choices he made in response to the crisis confronting his family would echo through generations, establishing patterns of thought and action that would shape major events throughout the Seven Kingdoms for decades to come. Standing in his tent as evening shadows lengthened across their encampment, studying maps that showed the underground waterways flowing beneath Castamere's foundations, Tywin contemplated the magnitude of the decision that circumstances had placed before him. The methods that might prove necessary to resolve their crisis would create precedents that fundamentally altered how power was exercised throughout Westeros. The sound of water flowing through distant streams carried on the evening air, a natural melody that had provided comfort to countless generations of men who had never imagined that such peaceful elements could be transformed into instruments of absolute destruction. But human ingenuity, when driven by necessity and unconstrained by conventional morality, could find ways to turn even the most innocent natural phenomena into weapons of terrifying effectiveness. Lord Tysay spent that evening walking alone through their camp, greeting soldiers who had answered his summons with a loyalty that their enemies had dismissed as weakness. These men had risked their lives and fortunes on the assumption that House Lannister possessed both the wisdom to command and the strength to protect those who served faithfully. The weight of that trust pressed down upon him like a mountain, demanding choices that his gentle nature had never prepared him to make. The stars wheeling overhead in their eternal patterns seemed to mock human concerns with their indifference to the rise and fall of houses and kingdoms. Yet for those whose lives hung in the balance, the decisions made in the coming days would echo through history, determining not just individual fates, but the very nature of civilization itself. Tomorrow would bring the final phase of their preparations for a confrontation that would reshape the Westerlands forever. The comfortable certainties that had governed feudal relationships for generations were about to be swept away in a tide of consequences that no one could have anticipated when the first mocking letter was written about Lord Titus's supposed weakness. The final piece of intelligence that would seal Castamere's fate arrived through channels so unexpected that even Tywin's suspicious nature had not anticipated them. A serving woman who had fled the castle during the night brought with her knowledge that transformed their understanding of both the rebellion's ultimate objectives and the means by which those objectives might be permanently frustrated. Elara had worked in Castamere's kitchens for over a decade, invisible to the lords and knights who planned rebellion in the castle's great halls, but perfectly positioned to observe details that would prove crucial to their downfall. Her escape had been motivated not by loyalty to House Lannister, but by terror at conversations she had overheard between Lord Roger Rain and his closest advisors during the previous evening's feast. The revelations she brought painted a picture of rebel planning that exceeded even the scope suggested by the captured correspondence. House Rain had been coordinating not just with ambitious houses throughout the Westerlands, but with enemies of the Iron Throne itself. Foreign gold from across the narrow sea had been funding their preparations, while promises of future alliance had been extended to powers that viewed Targaryen rule as an obstacle to their own ambitions. More immediately relevant to their current crisis was Elara's detailed knowledge of Castamere's internal layout and the daily routines that governed life within the fortress. Her years of service had provided her with understanding of passages and chambers that no outsider could reasonably possess, information that transformed theoretical possibilities into practical opportunities for those willing to act upon them. The great dining hall sits directly above the main water cistern, she explained to Tywin during their private interview, her voice trembling with the magnitude of what she was revealing. Lord Rain takes his evening meal there every night, surrounded by his captains and his family. They feel safe because the hall is in the deepest part of the castle, protected by walls of stone so thick that no siege engine could breach them. Tywin absorbed this intelligence with the cold precision that had become his hallmark, understanding immediately how such knowledge could be integrated into the unconventional approach he had been developing. The rebels' confidence in their fortress's impregnability was based on assumptions about the nature of threats they might face, assumptions that could be turned against them by enemies willing to think beyond traditional siege warfare. The technical consultations that followed confirmed what Tywin had already begun to suspect about the possibilities inherent in Castamere's unique construction. Master Tymon's expertise in underground engineering, combined with Elara's intimate knowledge of the castle's internal structure, revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited through methods that no conventional military education would have suggested. The red stone that gives Castamere its distinctive appearance is relatively soft and porous, Master Tymon explained during one of their increasingly detailed planning sessions. The underground streams that flow through the surrounding hills have been channeled to provide the castle with fresh water, but those same channels could potentially be altered to serve very different purposes. The implications of this technical assessment settled into Tywin's consciousness with the weight of absolute certainty. The rebels who believed their underground network made them invulnerable to conventional assault had created the very means by which their fortress could be turned into their tomb. The confidence that their extensive preparations had instilled would become their greatest liability when properly exploited. Lord Titus was not informed of these consultations or their conclusions. The gentle lord, who still hoped that some accommodation might be reached with their enemies, would have recoiled from the methods that circumstances seemed to demand. His exclusion from the final planning stages represented not betrayal but mercy, sparing him from complicity in choices that would haunt anyone with a functioning conscience. Sir Kevin participated in the technical discussions with a reluctance that spoke to his understanding of their implications. The young man who had always served as Tywin's moral anchor found himself increasingly isolated as his brother's thinking moved beyond the boundaries of acceptable conduct that had governed their upbringing. Yet loyalty to family ultimately proved stronger than personal qualms about the methods that family survival seemed to require. "Are we certain there's no other way?" Kevin asked during one of their final private conversations before implementation began. "Once we cross this line, there's no returning to the men we were before. The methods we use here will define everything we become afterward." Tywin's response revealed how completely his transformation had progressed from the idealistic boy who had discovered that first mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock. The comfortable certainties of his childhood had been burned away by harsh contact with realities that his father's generation had never prepared him to face. "The men we were before weren't strong enough to protect what matters most," he replied, with a finality that left no room for further debate. "If becoming someone harder is the price of ensuring that our family survives and our enemies never dare to threaten us again, then it's a price I'm willing to pay without hesitation." The practical preparations required to implement Tywin's solution involved coordination between Master Tywin's engineers and selected soldiers whose discretion could be absolutely trusted. The work proceeded in carefully planned stages, designed to avoid detection by rebel scouts while systematically creating conditions that would make Castamere's apparent strength into its ultimate weakness. The underground streams that had provided the castle with fresh water for centuries were gradually diverted and redirected through channels carved by men who understood exactly how stone and water could be made to serve purposes that their creators never intended. The engineering required was sophisticated enough to challenge even Master Tywin's considerable expertise, but not so complex as to be impossible given sufficient time and resources. As the final preparations neared completion, Tywin found himself contemplating the broader implications of what they were about to attempt. The methods that might prove necessary to crush the rebellion completely would create precedents that fundamentally altered how power was exercised throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Future generations would study their actions as examples of what became possible when traditional constraints were abandoned in favor of absolute effectiveness. The evening before their plan was to be implemented brought a stillness that seemed to settle over the entire landscape like a shroud. Even the night sounds that normally filled the darkness seemed muted, as if the natural world itself sensed the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The stars overhead continued their eternal dance, indifferent to human concerns, but somehow seeming to bear witness to choices that would echo through history. Standing outside his tent in that profound quiet, listening to the distant sound of water flowing through channels that would soon serve purposes far removed from their natural function, Tywin Lannister felt the weight of transformation settling around him like armor forged from necessity itself. The boy who had hoped that intelligence and determination might be sufficient to restore his family's honor was disappearing forever, replaced by someone infinitely more dangerous. The decision had been made. The preparations were complete. All that remained was the implementation of a solution so comprehensive in its ruthlessness that it would ensure no one would ever again dare to question the price of challenging House Lannister's authority. Tomorrow would witness the birth of a legend that would be whispered in fear throughout the Seven Kingdoms for generations to come. The comfortable assumptions that had governed feudal relationships since time immemorial were about to be swept away in a tide of consequences that would reshape the very nature of power in Westeros. The Golden Lion was about to roar with a voice that would silence all opposition forever. The night before, what would become known throughout the Seven Kingdoms as the destruction of Castamere brought together the key figures who would witness the birth of a new kind of power in Westeros. In a tent lit only by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on maps and engineering drawings, the final preparations were completed for an action that would echo through history as both masterwork of strategy and monument to the terrible clarity that necessity can impose upon those willing to embrace it. Master Tywin spread detailed drawings across the makeshift table, his weathered hands tracing the underground channels that centuries of Rain ancestors had carved beneath their ancestral seat. The irony was not lost on any of those present that the very foundations which had made Castamere seem impregnable would become the means of its complete annihilation. Generations of careful construction and defensive planning were about to be turned against those who had inherited their benefits. The main water channel runs directly beneath the Great Hall where Lord Rain holds court each evening. The master engineer explained with the precision of a man who understood that lives hung in the balance of his calculations. By redirecting the flow from 3 separate streams and blocking the natural drainage points, we can create pressures that the red stone was never designed to withstand. Sir Kevin listened to these technical details with the expression of a man watching his own moral foundations crumble beneath the weight of necessity. The gentle young knight who had always served as Tywin's conscience found himself confronting choices that offered no comfortable middle ground between family loyalty and personal honor. The methods they were discussing transcended traditional concepts of acceptable conduct in warfare. "How long will the process take once we begin?" Kevin asked, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he was hoping for an answer that might provide some last opportunity for mercy or hesitation. Master Tywin consulted his calculations with the thoroughness of a man who understood that precision might determine the difference between success and catastrophe. The initial flooding will begin within hours of redirecting the primary channels. Complete saturation of the lower levels should occur before dawn. The structural collapse of the foundation stones will follow inevitably once the water pressure exceeds the capacity of the drainage systems to compensate. Tywin absorbed these details with an equanimity that would have been disturbing in anyone twice his age. The transformation from idealistic youth to calculating strategist had progressed so completely that he could contemplate the systematic destruction of an entire noble house with no more emotional disturbance than he might feel while planning the renovation of Casterly Rock's stables. The intelligence that Elara had provided about daily routines within Castamere allowed them to time their operation with precision that would maximize its psychological impact throughout the Westerlands. Lord Rain's evening feasts had become legendary for their defiant celebration of rebellion against Lannister authority. The symbolic power of destroying the rebels at the very moment of their greatest confidence would resonate throughout the region for generations. They gather each night to toast their victory over House Lannister, Tywin observed, with the cold satisfaction of a master craftsman contemplating a particularly elegant solution to a complex problem. Tomorrow evening, as they raise their cups to celebrate our supposed weakness, they'll discover the true meaning of Lannister's strength. The broader implications of their planned action extended far beyond the immediate military objectives of crushing the current rebellion. Word of Castamere's fate would spread throughout the Seven Kingdoms, carrying with it a message about the consequences of challenging established authority that would fundamentally alter political calculations in every region of Westeros. Captain Adam Marbrand, whose loyalty to House Lannister had never wavered despite the temptations offered by rebel gold, understood the strategic necessity of their approach even as he struggled with its moral implications. The veteran soldier had witnessed enough warfare to recognize that half measures often proved more costly in human terms than decisive action, yet the scope of what they planned exceeded anything in his considerable experience. Once we take this step, there will be no possibility of reconciliation with any house that supported the rebellion, he observed, during their final strategic review. We'll have declared that challenging House Lannister is not merely dangerous, but utterly fatal to everyone who attempts it. Tywin's response revealed the depth of his understanding about the nature of power and the conditions necessary to maintain it across generations. The comfortable illusions that had sustained his father's approach to leadership had been stripped away by harsh contact with enemies who recognized no moral constraints on their ambitions. "Good," he replied, with a finality that admitted no possibility of reversal. "Fear is more reliable than love, more durable than respect, and infinitely more effective than mercy in maintaining order among those who would otherwise test our resolve at every opportunity." The night hours passed in detailed coordination between the various elements required to transform theory into devastating reality. Selected soldiers received specific instructions about their roles in the operation, while engineers made final adjustments to equipment that would redirect natural forces toward purposes their creators never intended. Lord Titus remained in his own tent, deliberately excluded from the final preparations by a son who understood that some knowledge would prove too burdensome for a conscience that retained its capacity for genuine remorse. The gentle lord would witness the results of their action, but he would be spared the crushing weight of having consciously chosen to cross lines that separated civilization from its alternatives. As dawn approached, bringing with it the day that would transform House Lannister's position throughout Westeros, Tywin found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock seemed like a stranger from another lifetime, his innocence and idealism consumed by the relentless demands of a world that offered no rewards for weakness or hesitation. The transformation had not been chosen freely, but imposed by enemies who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy everything his family had built across centuries of careful accumulation of wealth and influence. The methods he was about to employ represented not sadistic cruelty, but cold calculation, the logical endpoint of a process that began when other men decided that House Lannister could be treated with contempt rather than the respect due to their position. Standing outside his tent in the pre-dawn darkness, watching Master Tywin's engineers make their final preparations for an operation that would reshape the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms, Tywin contemplated the nature of the choice that circumstances had forced upon him. The comfortable middle ground between strength and mercy was disappearing, eroded by enemies who had abandoned such constraints in their pursuit of power. The sound of water flowing through carefully redirected channels carried on the morning air, a peaceful melody that would soon serve purposes far removed from its natural function. Human ingenuity, when driven by necessity and unconstrained by traditional morality, had found ways to transform even the most innocent natural phenomena into instruments of absolute destruction. The stars were fading from the sky as the sun prepared to rise on a day that would be remembered throughout Westeros as the moment when the true nature of Lannister power was revealed to a world that had forgotten the price of challenging those who possessed both the wealth to command loyalty and a will to enforce respect through any means necessary. The Golden Lion was about to demonstrate that some lessons could only be taught through methods so comprehensive in their devastation that they would never need to be repeated. The morning that would forever alter the nature of power in Westeros began with the kind of deceptive tranquility that often precedes events of world-changing magnitude. Mist rose from the valleys surrounding Castamere as it had for countless centuries, while ravens called from distant trees with voices that seemed to carry warnings unheeded by those who most needed to hear them. Tywin stood on the ridge overlooking the Redstone Fortress, where his family's enemies celebrated their anticipated triumph, watching smoke rise from chimneys that would never again warm living inhabitants. The sight should have brought satisfaction to someone who had labored so intensively to reach this moment, yet he found himself experiencing something closer to the hollow recognition that some victories could only be purchased through the complete abandonment of the person one had been. Master Tywin approached with the measured steps of a man carrying intelligence that would seal the fate of everyone within Castamere's seemingly impregnable walls. His engineers had completed their work during the night hours, redirecting streams and blocking drainage channels with a precision that transformed natural water flow into an instrument of absolute destruction. The technical mastery required for such an operation represented generations of accumulated knowledge about stone and water, now applied to purposes that no previous generation would have contemplated. The primary channels are in position. The master engineer reported with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that history would remember this day regardless of his personal feelings about the methods being employed. Once the secondary redirections are completed, water pressure will begin building in the lower chambers within hours. The foundation stones were never designed to withstand such forces. Tywin absorbed this information with the cold precision that had become his defining characteristic, understanding that they were approaching the point beyond which retreat would become impossible. The boy who had once hoped that intelligence and determination might restore his family's honor through conventional means was about to discover what it truly meant to become someone who inspired fear rather than contempt. Sir Kevan joined them on the ridge, his expression carrying the weight of a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with choices that offered no comfortable resolution. The gentle knight who had always served as his brother's moral compass found himself confronting the reality that some problems could only be solved by those willing to exceed their enemies in ruthlessness and calculation. "Are we certain this is the only way?" Kevan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and was seeking confirmation rather than alternatives. "Once we take this step, there will be no possibility of claiming we acted in the heat of battle or responded to immediate threat. This is calculated destruction on a scale that will echo through generations." Tywin's response revealed how completely his thinking had evolved beyond the moral frameworks that had governed their upbringing. The comfortable certainties that had sustained him through childhood had been burned away by contact with enemies who recognized no constraints on their ambitions other than the practical limitations imposed by superior force. The Rains chose this outcome. "When they decided that House Lannister could be destroyed with impunity," he replied, with a finality that admitted no possibility of reversal. "They forced us to become whatever was necessary to ensure our survival. The responsibility for what happens today lies with those who believed our family's extinction was both desirable and achievable." The technical preparations continued throughout the morning hours, with engineers making final adjustments to equipment that would transform peaceful streams into torrents capable of bringing down walls that had stood since before the conquest. The work proceeded with mechanical efficiency that masked the magnitude of what was being attempted, as if redirecting water flow was no different from any other construction project. Captain Adam Marbrand coordinated the positioning of troops who would prevent any attempt at evacuation once the operation began. The veteran soldier understood that half measures in such circumstances often proved more costly than decisive action. Yet the scope of their planned response exceeded anything in his considerable military experience. "No one leaves Castamere today," Tywin instructed with the authority of someone who had assumed command regardless of formal rank or traditional hierarchy. "Word of what happens here must spread throughout the Westerlands exactly as we intend, without modification or misinterpretation by survivors who might attempt to minimize the scope of our response." The intelligence that continued arriving from loyalist sources throughout the region painted a picture of rebel confidence that bordered on arrogance. House Tarbeck had apparently begun celebrating their anticipated victory, while smaller houses that had supported the rebellion were already dividing territories they expected to seize from a defeated House Lannister. The disconnect between rebel expectations and the reality they were about to confront would serve as an object lesson in the dangers of underestimating enemies who possessed both the resources and the will to exceed all reasonable limits in defense of their position. Lord Tywin emerged from his tent as the sun reached its zenith, his expression carrying the confusion of a man who sensed that momentous events were unfolding around him without fully understanding their nature or scope. The gentle lord who had hoped to resolve their crisis through negotiation and compromise was about to witness the birth of a new kind of power that would reshape political relationships throughout the Seven Kingdoms. "Tywin," he said quietly, approaching his son with the careful steps of someone walking across ground that might give way at any moment. "I sense that something significant is planned for today, something beyond conventional military action. As your father and your lord, I'm asking you to tell me what you intend." The moment represented a crossroads not just for House Lannister, but for the relationship between father and son that had sustained Tywin through his transformation from idealistic youth to calculating strategist. The choice he made about how much to reveal would determine whether Lord Tytos could maintain any illusions about the methods that family survival seemed to require. "Father," Tywin replied, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the iron certainty that had come to define his approach to their crisis. "Today we ensure that no one will ever again dare to threaten our family's legacy. The methods required are not pleasant, but they are necessary. Your conscience will be clearer if you focus on the outcome rather than the process." The evasion satisfied neither of them, but it preserved Lord Tywin from the crushing weight of conscious complicity in choices that would haunt anyone who retained the capacity for genuine remorse. The gentle lord returned to his tent with the expression of someone who understood that knowledge could become a burden too heavy for any decent man to bear. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the landscape, the final preparations reached completion with a precision that spoke to months of careful planning compressed into days of intensive execution. Master Tywin's engineers had created conditions that would make Castamere's apparent strength into its ultimate weakness, while Tywin's psychological understanding of their enemies had ensured that the operation would commence at the moment of maximum symbolic impact. The evening feast that Lord Roger Rain held each night to celebrate his anticipated triumph over House Lannister had become legendary throughout the region for its defiant extravagance. Tonight's gathering would indeed prove memorable, though not in ways that any of the participants could possibly anticipate. Standing on the ridge as sunset painted the red stone walls of Castamere with colors that seemed prophetic of what was to come, Tywin contemplated the nature of the transformation that circumstances had forced upon him. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock was disappearing forever, replaced by someone whose name would be whispered in fear throughout the Seven Kingdoms for generations to come. The comfortable assumptions that had governed feudal relationships since time immemorial were about to be swept away in a tide of consequences that would reshape the very nature of power in Westeros. The Golden Lion was about to roar with a voice that would silence all opposition through the simple expedient of making clear that some challenges carried costs too terrible for any rational person to accept. The great hall of Castamere had never looked more magnificent than it did on the final evening of its existence. Tapestries bearing the red lion of House Rain hung from walls carved from the distinctive stone that gave the castle its name, while golden braziers cast dancing light across assembled nobles who believed themselves masters of a new order in the Westerlands. The irony of their celebration taking place directly above the water channels that would become their tomb was lost on everyone except the young man watching from the distant ridge who had engineered this convergence of arrogance and fate. Lord Roger Rain raised his goblet in the traditional toast that had marked each evening since the rebellion began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed victory was not merely possible, but inevitable. The assembled lords and knights joined their voices to his, celebrating the anticipated downfall of House Lannister with an enthusiasm that spoke to years of carefully cultivated resentment against their traditional overlords. "To the dawn of a new age in the Westerlands," Lord Rain proclaimed, his words echoing off stone walls that had sheltered his family for over 300 years. "To freedom from the tyranny of those who mistake gold for strength and birthright for wisdom. Tomorrow we march on Casterly Rock itself, and the realm will witness the rise of houses worthy to lead." The cheers that greeted this declaration reached such volume that they might have been heard across the valley, if anyone had been positioned to listen for sounds of celebration rather than the more subtle noises that Master Tywin's engineers were creating in the passages far below. Water had been flowing through redirected channels for hours, building pressure against drainage systems that were never designed to handle such volume or force. Tywin watched the distant lights of the castle with the cold satisfaction of a master craftsman witnessing the final moments before his greatest work reached completion. Every element of the operation had proceeded exactly as planned, from the technical modifications that would transform peaceful streams into instruments of destruction to the psychological calculations that had ensured their enemies would be gathered in the most vulnerable location at precisely the right moment. Master Tywin stood beside him, consulting instruments that measured water pressure and flow rates with the precision necessary to predict when natural forces would exceed the structural limitations of red stone foundations. His weathered face showed no emotion as he monitored readings that would determine the fate of everyone currently celebrating within Castamere's seemingly impregnable walls. "The primary supports are approaching critical stress levels," the engineer reported with the clinical detachment of someone whose professional expertise had been turned toward purposes that transcended conventional engineering applications. "Foundation collapse should commence within the next hour, beginning with the lower chambers and progressing upward as water pressure destabilizes successive levels." The technical details carried weight beyond their immediate tactical significance. What they were witnessing represented the birth of new possibilities for those willing to think beyond traditional approaches to warfare and politics. Future generations would study this night as the moment when human ingenuity, unleashed from conventional moral constraints, demonstrated its capacity to transform natural forces into weapons of absolute devastation. The Sir Kevin approached with the expression of a man who had spent hours wrestling with choices that offered no comfortable resolution. The gentle knight who had always served as his brother's conscience found himself confronting the reality that loyalty to family sometimes demanded the complete abandonment of personal principles that had previously seemed immutable. "Tywin," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that suggested final recognition of what they were about to witness. "When this night ends, we'll no longer be the same men who began this campaign. The methods we're employing here will define everything we become afterward. Are you prepared for that transformation?" Tywin's response revealed the depth of his understanding about the nature of power and the conditions necessary to maintain it across generations. The comfortable illusions that had sustained his father's approach to leadership had been stripped away by harsh contact with enemies who recognized no moral constraints on their ambitions. "The men we were before tonight weren't strong enough to protect what matters most," he replied with a certainty that had been forged through months of impossible choices. "If becoming someone harder is the price of ensuring that our enemies never again dare to threaten everything our ancestors built, then it's a transformation I embrace without reservation or regret." The first signs of structural failure became audible as a deep rumbling that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth beneath Castamere's foundations. The sound carried across the valley with a resonance that spoke to forces beyond human scale, as if the mountain itself was expressing displeasure with those who had dared to hollow out its substance for their own purposes. Within the great hall, the evening celebration continued despite growing awareness that something unusual was occurring in the lower levels of the castle. Servants reported flooding in the cellars, while guards noted strange sounds echoing through passages that had been carved from living rock by generations of Rain ancestors. Lord Roger Rain's initial response to these disturbances revealed the fundamental miscalculation that had made this night possible. His confidence in Castamere's defensive capabilities was so complete that he interpreted the flooding as a minor inconvenience rather than the first stage of systematic destruction. The possibility that enemies might possess both the technical knowledge and the moral flexibility necessary to attempt such an operation simply lay beyond his imagination. "Seal the lower passages," he commanded, with the authority of a man who believed his orders could control forces that had already moved beyond human management. "Double the guard on all entrances. If the Lannisters think to surprise us through some hidden passage, they'll discover that Castamere's defenders are prepared for any conventional assault." The irony of his response was lost on everyone except those who had engineered the convergence of natural forces that was systematically undermining the structural integrity of the entire fortress. Water pressure continued building against drainage systems that were failing in cascade fashion, creating conditions that would make the castle's apparent strength into its ultimate weakness. The moment of final collapse arrived with a violence that exceeded even Master Tywin's calculations. The Great Hall, positioned directly above the primary water channels, became the focal point of destruction as centuries of careful construction surrendered to forces that human engineering had redirected but could no longer control. The sound of stone surrendering to water carried across the valley like the death cry of a mountain, while dust and debris rose into the night air in a column that seemed to reach towards stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless human ambitions. In moments that felt both eternal and instantaneous, the seat of House Rain disappeared beneath torrents that had been transformed from life-giving streams into instruments of absolute annihilation. Tywin watched the destruction with an expression that combined satisfaction with recognition of what he had become in order to achieve such comprehensive victory. The boy who had hoped that intelligence and determination might restore his family's honor through conventional means had discovered what it truly meant to inspire fear rather than contempt. The silence that followed the collapse was profound beyond anything that nature could produce, as if the very landscape was absorbing the magnitude of what had occurred. Where Castamere had stood for over 300 years, only dark water remained, reflecting starlight that seemed somehow different than it had just moments before. Master Tywin began collecting his instruments with movements that spoke to professional satisfaction in work completed according to specifications, regardless of its broader implications. His engineering expertise had been applied to purposes that transcended conventional construction projects, creating precedents that would influence military thinking for generations to come. "It's finished," he reported with the clinical precision that had characterized his approach throughout the operation. "Complete structural collapse has eliminated all possibility of survival. The water will drain naturally over the coming days, but Castamere itself has been erased from the landscape as thoroughly as if it had never existed." Standing on the ridge where he had planned and witnessed the destruction of his family's enemies, Tywin Lannister contemplated the magnitude of what had been accomplished through methods that exceeded all previous limits of acceptable conduct. The comfortable certainties that had governed feudal relationships for generations had been swept away in a tide of consequences that would reshape the very nature of power throughout the Seven Kingdoms. The Golden Lion had roared with a voice that would echo through history, establishing new standards for what became possible when traditional constraints were abandoned in favor of absolute effectiveness. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath Casterly Rock had completed his transformation into someone whose name would be whispered in fear for as long as men remembered the price of challenging those who possessed both the resources to command loyalty and the will to enforce respect through any means necessary. The dawn that followed the destruction of Castamere revealed a landscape fundamentally altered not just by the physical disappearance of the ancient fortress, but by the psychological transformation that such comprehensive annihilation imposed upon all who witnessed its aftermath. Where red stone walls had stood for centuries, only dark water remained, reflecting a sky that seemed somehow different than it had appeared just hours before the old certainties had been swept away. News of House Rains' complete extinction spread throughout the Westerlands with a speed that suggested ravens themselves understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Every keep, every village, every crossroads inn received word that the rebellion which had seemed so promising just days earlier had ended not in negotiated settlement or conventional military defeat, but in the absolute erasure of its primary architects from the annals of living history. House Tarbeck's response to intelligence about Castamere's fate revealed the psychological impact that Tywin had calculated with such precision. Lord Walderan Tarbeck, who had spent months preparing for conventional warfare against what he believed were weakened Lannister forces, found himself confronting evidence that his enemies possessed capabilities that transcended anything within his experience or imagination. The surrender that arrived at the Lannister camp before the sun had fully cleared the eastern hills was so complete in its submission that it bordered on self-destruction. Lord Tarbeck offered not merely to renounce his rebellion and return borrowed gold, but to dismantle his own house's power structure entirely. The letter that accompanied his formal capitulation spoke in terms that suggested a man who had glimpsed forces beyond his comprehension and recognized that survival required abandoning every principle except absolute obedience to Lannister authority. Yet Tywin's response to this abject surrender revealed how completely his thinking had evolved beyond conventional approaches to feudal relationships. The boy who might once have accepted such submissions with relief had been replaced by someone who understood that examples of defiance required examples of consequence that would resonate through generations rather than fade with the passage of seasons. Lord Tarbeck's surrender is noted and rejected, he informed the trembling messenger who had brought the offer. House Tarbeck chose to support the rebellion against our family's authority. They will share the fate they believed appropriate for House Lannister. The systematic destruction of Tarbeck Hall that followed demonstrated the comprehensiveness of the new methods that Tywin had developed for dealing with challenges to his family's position. Unlike Castamere, which had been eliminated through the redirection of natural forces, Tarbeck Hall fell to more conventional assault, but assault conducted with a thoroughness that left no possibility of future rebuilding or recovery. Every stone was cast down, every timber burned, every trace of House Tarbeck's existence methodically erased from the landscape, as if the family had never possessed the presumption to challenge their betters. The gold and silver accumulated over generations of careful stewardship was redistributed among houses that had remained loyal, while lands that had sustained Tarbeck prosperity were granted to bannermen whose service during the crisis had demonstrated their worthiness for advancement. The psychological impact of these twin destructions resonated throughout the Seven Kingdoms far beyond the borders of the Westerlands. Ravens carried word to King's Landing, to Winterfell, to Highgarden and Storm's End, describing methods that exceeded traditional concepts of feudal warfare in scope and imagination. The comfortable assumption that rebellious houses might suffer military defeat or political marginalization had been replaced by recognition that some enemies possessed both the capability and the inclination to erase their opponents from history entirely. King Aegon V's response to intelligence about events in the Westerlands revealed the broader implications of Tywin's transformation for the political stability of the realm as a whole. The gentle king who had spent his reign attempting to govern through consensus and compromise found himself confronting evidence that power relationships throughout his kingdom were being redefined by those willing to exceed all previous limits in pursuit of their objectives. Lord Tywin Lannister has demonstrated capabilities that transcend anything we have witnessed since the conquest itself. The king observed during a small council meeting that would be remembered for its recognition that the comfortable certainties governing feudal relationships had been fundamentally altered. We must consider how to respond to methods that, while effective in achieving their immediate objectives, could destabilize the entire structure of noble obligations upon which our kingdom depends. Yet even as the Crown grappled with the implications of new possibilities for those willing to abandon traditional constraints, the immediate effects of Tywin's methods were exactly what he had calculated. Throughout the Westerlands, houses that had wavered in their loyalty to House Lannister discovered renewed appreciation for the advantages of unwavering fealty. The gold that had been flowing from Castamere and Tarbeck Hall to potential rebels dried up entirely, replaced by offerings from nervous lords who sought to demonstrate their continued worthiness for Lannister protection. The restoration of order throughout the region proceeded with efficiency that validated every aspect of Tywin's strategic thinking. Where months of negotiation and compromise had failed to resolve the crisis of authority that his father's gentle leadership had allowed to develop, decisive action implemented without regard for conventional moral constraints had achieved comprehensive success within days. Lord Titus emerged from his tent on the morning after Tarbeck Hall's destruction with the expression of a man who had aged years in the space of a single campaign. The gentle lord who had hoped to govern through kindness and consensus found himself confronting the reality that his son had preserved their family's legacy through methods that challenged every principle he had attempted to instill during Tywin's upbringing. "We have won a great victory," he said quietly, his words carrying undertones that suggested recognition of costs that might not become fully apparent for years or even generations. "But I fear that the methods required to achieve this victory have transformed us into something our ancestors would not recognize." Tywin's response revealed how completely his priorities had evolved beyond the moral frameworks that had governed his childhood. The comfortable certainties that had sustained him through his early years had been burned away by contact with enemies who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy everything his family had built across centuries of careful accumulation. "Our ancestors built their legacy through whatever methods proved necessary to ensure their survival and prosperity," he replied with a certainty that brooked no argument. "If those methods appear different from our own, it's because they faced different challenges. We've done what was required to protect what they left us, and future generations will judge us by our success rather than our sentimentality." The songs that began appearing throughout the realm in the weeks following the destruction of the rebellious houses revealed the cultural impact of Tywin's comprehensive response to the crisis. The Rains of Castamere became the most requested composition in every tavern and great hall, its haunting melody and ominous lyrics serving as both entertainment and warning about the consequences of challenging those who possessed the will to exceed all reasonable limits in defense of their position. The ballad's popularity extended far beyond the Westerlands, carried by traveling minstrels who recognized that audiences throughout the Seven Kingdoms hungered for stories that captured the magnitude of what had occurred. The simple refrain about autumn rains washing away the pride of houses that had forgotten their place resonated with listeners who understood that they were witnessing the birth of new possibilities for those willing to abandon traditional constraints. Standing in the great hall of Casterly Rock upon their return from the campaign, surrounded by tapestries and treasures that had been preserved through methods that exceeded anything their creators could have imagined, Tywin contemplated the nature of the transformation that circumstances had forced upon him. The boy who had discovered that mocking letter in the tunnels beneath their home had completed his evolution into someone whose name would be spoken with fear and respect in equal measure for generations to come. The Golden Lion had established new standards for what became possible when family loyalty was combined with unlimited willingness to do whatever proved necessary for survival and supremacy. The comfortable assumptions that had governed feudal relationships since time immemorial had been replaced by recognition that some houses possessed both the resources and the ruthlessness necessary to redefine the very nature of power in Westeros. Years have passed since that fateful night when the red walls of Castamere disappeared beneath dark waters, yet the lessons learned in those terrible hours continue to echo through the halls of Casterly Rock, with the persistence of ancient songs that refuse to fade from memory. The golden lion that emerged from that crucible of necessity became something both more and less than what his ancestors had been, shaped by choices that no previous generation had been forced to contemplate. The great hall where Lord Tywin now holds court bears witness to the transformation that began with a crumpled letter discovered in forgotten tunnels and reached its completion in the systematic destruction of those who had dared to challenge Lannister supremacy. Tapestries woven with threads of gold catch the light from braziers that have burned continuously since before the conquest, their flames reflecting off surfaces that have witnessed the rise of one of the most formidable political minds in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Evening settles over Lannisport Harbor, as it has for countless centuries, bringing with it the gentle sounds of commerce and prosperity that speak to the enduring strength of House Lannister's foundation. Ships rock at anchor beneath stars that have wheeled through their eternal patterns since before men carved castles from living stone, their masts swaying with rhythms as old as the tides themselves. The deep mines that honeycomb the rock continue their ancient song of wealth and abundance, their tunnels humming with the quiet industry that has sustained Lannister power through generations of triumph and challenge. Gold flows from those depths like water from mountain springs, funding the kind of influence that shapes kingdoms and topples dynasties with equal ease. Yet in the quiet moments between the demands of lordship and the complexities of political maneuvering, when the castle settles into the comfortable silence that follows a day of profitable enterprise, Tywin sometimes finds himself remembering the boy who once walked these same corridors with dreams unmarked by the harsh pragmatism that necessity had imposed upon his thinking. The transformation had been neither sought nor welcomed, but rather accepted as the price of ensuring that his family's legacy would endure when lesser houses had been reduced to cautionary tales told to frighten children. The methods that had proved necessary to secure that survival were not pleasant to contemplate, yet they had achieved their objectives with a completeness that validated every difficult choice. Sir Kevan remains at his brother's side, aged now by years of loyal service and the weight of shared knowledge about what true power sometimes requires. The gentle knight who had once questioned the moral implications of their choices has learned to find peace in the recognition that some burdens must be carried by those strong enough to bear them, sparing others from the crushing weight of necessary decisions. The gardens of Casterly Rock bloom with flowers that have never known the touch of winter's harshness, protected by walls that rise from foundations carved from the very bones of the earth. Roses and jasmine perfume the evening air, with fragrances that speak to the enduring beauty that wealth and power can preserve when properly applied to their cultivation and protection. Children play in courtyards where their laughter echoes off stone that has sheltered generations of Lannisters, their games unchanged despite the passage of years and the evolution of the political landscape that their presence represents. Their innocence remains intact because others have made the choices necessary to ensure that innocence could survive in a world that offers no guarantees to those unwilling to fight for what they value most. The westernmost towers of the rock catch the last light of sunset, their windows glowing like golden eyes that watch over domains stretching to horizons where sea meets sky in lines as straight and eternal as the principles that guide those wise enough to understand the true nature of power. That light has witnessed the rise and fall of countless ambitions, yet it continues to shine with steady warmth on those who have earned the right to stand in its glow. Trade flows through Lannisport's busy harbors with the regularity of seasonal cycles, bringing prosperity that touches every life in the growing city below. Merchants from across the known world compete for the privilege of dealing with representatives of a house whose word has become more valuable than gold itself, their eagerness speaking to reputations built through consistent demonstration of both reliability and consequence. The ancient songs still sung in taverns throughout the realm carry melodies that blend joy and warning in equal measure. reminding listeners that the wheel of fortune turns for all houses, but stops longest for those who understand how to oil its mechanisms with the proper combination of reward and retribution. The Rains of Castamere has become more than entertainment, evolving into a cultural touchstone that shapes behavior across multiple generations. Ravens continue to arrive from across the Seven Kingdoms, bearing requests for counsel, offers of alliance, and reports of situations that require the kind of decisive intervention that has become synonymous with Lannister involvement in major political developments. Each message represents recognition that some problems can only be solved by those who possess both the resources and the ruthlessness necessary to achieve lasting solutions. The Great Library of Casterly Rock preserves records that chronicle not just the rise of House Lannister, but the evolution of power itself through the hands of those wise enough to understand that strength without will is meaningless, while will without strength is merely aspiration. Future generations will study these accounts to understand how individual choices can reshape the destiny of kingdoms. In the deepest chambers beneath the rock, where silence reigns eternal, and the weight of mountain stone creates a peace that human concerns cannot disturb, the memory of transformation rests like a sleeping dragon that might wake if circumstances ever again demand that House Lannister demonstrate why their name inspires both respect and fear throughout the civilized world. The stars wheel overhead in patterns that have remained unchanged since the first men looked up at night skies and dreamed of legacies that might endure beyond the brief span of individual lives. Those same stars have witnessed the rise of the Golden Lion to heights that seemed impossible to the mocked boy who once discovered bitter truths in forgotten tunnels, yet they continue their ancient dance with serene indifference to human achievement. Water flows eternally down from mountain peaks, carving channels through stone with patience that measures time in geological ages rather than human generations. That same water, when properly directed by those who understand its power, can serve purposes that range from nurturing life to delivering the kind of comprehensive justice that ensures certain lessons never need to be taught twice. The peaceful conclusion of night settles over the Westerlands like a blanket woven from prosperity and security, bringing rest to those who have earned the right to sleep without fear because others remain vigilant in defense of all they have built together. The Golden Lion sleeps but never deeply, and its dreams are filled with the knowledge that some victories, once achieved through methods that transform their authors, create foundations upon which empires can rest secure for generations yet unborn. Thus ends the tale of how a boy became a legend, how love for family became an instrument of terror, and how the pursuit of respect evolved into a mastery of fear that would echo through the annals of history as long as men remember the price of challenging those who possess both the gold to purchase loyalty and the iron will to enforce it through any means that prove necessary.